Jack Chick is a bit of an ephemeral figure. He's rarely makes any public appearances or gives interviews, and it's almost impossible to find an actual photograph of him. Obviously, and I'm assuming he's honest in everything he's saying in terms of actually believing this stuff, you have to come to the conclusion that on certain things he's a little bit pretty far out there, and it's quite amazing. He's very prone to believing in various conspiracy theories, and they make their way into his comic books. Sometimes more subtly, and other times, as in the one we'll be examining today, the attack, very blatantly, and particularly this one is pretty much backing up what you would call King James onlyism. I'm just going to point out how really kind of bizarre these things are, and that they make no sense whatsoever. Now, given it's a comic strip, I don't really expect them to necessarily be giving footnotes or anything, but you just have to wonder, where did they come up with this stuff? You can take a look at what I'll basically be covering, the 14 claims, and going through them. And it's not everything in the comic strip, but I think it's enough to show that this is, well, frankly, it's nuts. The first claim is that the King James translators were systematically assassinated for their role in bringing the Bible to the English-speaking world. And that's in the beginning of the comic strip. You'll see this inference that this particular translator, this is another one who's dead, who's been poisoned or something. Frankly, it's a ridiculous claim. There's not one iota of substantiating evidence. It's just a figment of Jack Chick's imagination. And frankly, if he's going to say that, the burden of proof's upon him and his supporters to produce any evidence. Of course, there isn't any. The next claim is that the King James translators were primarily Puritans. Frankly, this is a fantasy. The vast majority of the translation committee, including those in positions of leadership, were members of the Church of England. They were Anglicans, not Puritans. And frankly, if you actually read the writings of people like Lancelot Andrewes and others who were leading the translation effort, it's far removed from the fundamentalism of Jack Chick. They were High Church Anglicans. This is the period where of the Caroline Divines, and they're nothing at all like what Chick promotes. And by the way, I find it a little bit odd that Jack Chick would hold up the Puritans as his heroes in this story, considering that he, like many fundamentalists, are vocal opponents of Calvinism. Apparently, Chick is unaware the Puritans were actually Calvinists. Next, he claims that the Apocrypha was always rejected by true Christians and was inserted by the Council of Trent. Now, throughout church history, the books we commonly call the Apocrypha, basically those that appear in Catholic and Orthodox but not Protestant, most Protestant Bibles, were actually accepted by the church. It really wasn't, honestly, so much a conscious decision as merely receiving what was in earlier codices used by the church of Old Testament books. It was just basically what was passed on. I don't think there was any conscious decision to include or exclude. It's more or less receiving what they had already had. Now, as time went on, there were those who questioned the canonical status of these books. The ironic thing, of course, is that the two who were most known for being opponents of the Apocrypha were Origen and Jerome, and the KJVO onlyists routinely condemned them. However, if you do read the preface of the original King James Version, you'll find that Origen's work on the Hexapla, and particularly Jerome's work on the Vulgate, were praised by the King James Version translators. And in fact, as can easily be seen in the 39 Articles of Religion of the Church of England, in effect at the time, the Apocrypha was was stated to be read in the church for morals and example, but not to formulate doctrine. So in fact, it was, though not given the same status as the books of Old and New Testament, were considered something of value to be read in the church, in the Church of England. So he's just completely off base on this point. Next, there's a claim that Satan used intellectuals in Alexandria to mutilate the Old and New Testament. Again, no evidence provided, and there isn't any. In fact, many of the verses that were supposedly mutilated, the claims, as claimed by King James only, not only don't appear in any Alexandrian manuscripts, but don't appear in Byzantine manuscripts until many centuries later, and are quite obvious alterations of the original text. They don't appear anywhere. No. But of course, if you're simply going to assume the King James Version is right because, well, you're assuming the King James Version is right, you'll end up in little pieces of circular reasoning like that. The next claim is that the Alexandrian Bibles, as they put it, downplayed such doctrines as the deity of Christ and the virgin birth. The sheer idiocy of his claim can be seen in the fact that when the presbyter Arius arrived in Alexandria and began questioning the full deity of Christ, he was condemned immediately by Bishop Alexander, who then led the fight against Arius's teachings at the Council of Nicaea. In succeeding decades, the fight to defend the full deity of Christ in the church was actually led by Alexander's successor, Athanasius. So, in fact, you've had the defense of the full deity of Christ being led by bishops from where? Alexandria. Furthermore, anyone familiar with the theology of the Alexandrian Church fathers would be well aware of their emphasis on things like the virgin birth and the deity of Christ and others. Once more, this is just demonstrating that Chick basically has no idea what he's talking about. Next, he states that the Roman Emperor Constantine was the first pope. He really said that, honest. It's there. You can go read it. Now, given that the term in the early church was reserved for patriarchs of the church, bishops and patriarchates, particularly that of Rome, but also in Alexandria and a few other places. Do I have to explain why this is nuts? Do I really? I hope not. But let's just be honest here. It's nuts. Next, it's stated that Constantine ordered 50 Bibles to be created from the Alexandrian manuscripts. Really? Now, Constantine did pay for 50 new Bibles to be created, but he didn't specify any particular manuscripts. And given the whole question of Alexandrian versus Byzantine as a modern construct, it's unlikely anyone at the time noted there were such streams. In fact, the Byzantine texts do not start really showing up until the 4th century anyway, and I would also point out that if, in fact, he was forcing these upon the church, then why is it that in his city, Constantinople, that's where the Byzantine manuscripts are created? So the post-Constantinian church actually is not using Alexandrian manuscripts. They're using Byzantine ones because that's why they're called Byzantine. So let's just say this claims, well, it's full of holes. Next comes the claim that Jerome used the Alexandrian manuscripts to translate the Vulgate. Well, first of all, let's point out that the whole question of Alexandrian versus Byzantine applies only to the New Testament. That whole question refers to New Testament manuscripts, not Old Testament manuscripts. In fact, Jerome spent most of his time in his translation on the Old Testament, and he translated that directly from the Hebrew. The New Testament appears to have been an editing of existing Latin manuscripts that he checked against various Greek manuscripts that were not of any consistent type, because you'll see Western, Byzantine, and Alexandrian readings all make their way into the Vulgate all over the place. In fact, that's why many of the Alexandrian readings seemed odd compared to those of the traditional text. in both Catholic and Protestant churches, because Jerome didn't have an Alexandrian text either. It's just, this whole thing is just completely ridiculous and just demonstrates that the people making these sorts of claims really have no familiarity with the Vulgate. In fact, if they check, many of the texts that they often dispute are the same in the Vulgate as in the KJV, and they're different than the modern texts that are based on the earlier Alexandrian manuscripts. So the whole thing is just really kind of silly, but what else do you expect? Next comes the claim that the Bible was placed on the Index of Forbidden Books by the Council of Toulouse in 1229. Now, this is a revision of an earlier claim for the same thing at a supposed Council of Valencia that originally appeared in Boetner's Roman Catholicism and was later changed to Council of Toulouse when it was pointed out that Valencia was under control of Moorish Spain at the time, so it was unlikely that Catholic Church would be holding any councils there, local or otherwise. Now, so what do we have to say about this? Well, first of all, considering the Index of Prohibited Books was not created until 1559, adding something to it 3 centuries before then would be quite a trick. So that, at least that part of it, that it being put on an index is just simply nonsense. Now, what happened was this council in question was a local one dealing with the Albigensians, which was a dualist sect that existed at the time and was a major heresy in 13th century France and other parts of Western Europe. The ban was actually on having possession of a Bible without a license to preach. Now, what you have to realize, of course, and I'm not defending it, but what you have to realize this was not meant to, quote, keep the average guy in the street from reading the Bible or, end quote, something like that. Because, frankly, at the time, the average guy in the street couldn't read anything. They were all illiterate. And again, not defending this, but you can't, it basically was, it was a legal means to prevent the Albigensians from being legally able to preach their doctrine. That's what it was all about, and it only applied in that area. But you can't really compare this to the situation that happens later in the Reformation when a literate middle class was emerging, and to do so is fairly anachronistic. So this really has nothing to do with making the Bible a prohibited book. Obviously, they continued to use it in their services. They were basically preventing other people from preaching what they considered heretical doctrine with it. And again, I'm not defending such persecutions. I'm just pointing out that the inference here that the Bible itself was banned is just not true. Next, they state that the name given to the preserved Word of God was the Textus Receptus. Well, actually, the Textus Receptus is the name given to a family of critical editions of the Greek New Testament, beginning with the first edition of the Greek text by Desiderius Erasmus. It has nothing to do with the Old Testament, and prior to Erasmus, the Textus Receptus did not exist. Its readings were largely influenced by what manuscripts Erasmus and his successors in this family of texts, such as Stephanus and Beza, had on hand at the time. And really, that's about it. You don't find this text prior to that period. And by the way, contrary to the common claim by many King James onlyists, the Textus Receptus is not the same thing as the majority text. Next comes the assertion that the Catholic Church claims 68 million victims from 1200 AD onward. You know, do these folks ever consider that Europe would have been a ghost continent if that were true? Now, certainly the Catholic Church had blood on its hands in the Inquisition, the Crusades, but 68 million? Where did they come up with that number? I mean, come on, be serious. Where do you come up with a number like 68 million? It's how do they come up with it? They make it up. Next, we find the Jesuits were dedicated to the complete destruction of the Textus Receptus. Well, that would be kind of a strange thing to do, considering the initial edition of the Textus Receptus was created by a Catholic priest and approved by a pope, but that's just me. And of course, during the translation of the King James Version, sinister Catholic agents attempted to switch the texts with readings from their Alexandrian manuscripts, but were prevented by having guards posted at the door watching their every move. Where do they come up with this cloak and dagger nonsense? First of all, the Alexandrian manuscripts were largely still sitting in monasteries in Egypt, and the Catholic Church wasn't even aware of them, and probably wouldn't have thought much of them if they were. And any analysis of them was centuries away. There were no guards at any tables. Most involved were respected figures of the Church of England. They were Anglicans. And frankly, they weren't translating from manuscripts. They were translating from existing critical editions of the Greek and Hebrew, not from individual manuscripts. And they were also aided by previous editions in English of the Bible. They were guided by that, but they were largely translating from critical editions, of Erasmus and Beza and Stephanus of the New Testament, and also of a critical edition of the Old Testament as well. So there was this whole idea of slipping in. I mean, it's just silly. It's just absolutely ridiculous. But, what do you expect? Again, what do you expect? So there you have it. That's my little critique of Jack Chick's foray into King James onlyism, the attack.